It is 8:27 a.m. on the 18th of November. We are sitting in Barcelona airport. The sun has just come up. It's beautiful. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling really excited to go to Malaysia, to get to Malaysia. Really sort of worried and daunted by the gigantic flight. It's going to be like total 15 hours, but divided into two, which is, ugh, I don't like it.
Which is, in my opinion, not long enough because then you don't get to sleep for full 8 hours, and I'm very passionate about that.
That's Tess and I on our way to Malaysia for the Global Investigative Journalism Conference. It's this huge 1,000-person gathering of journalists from across the world that happens every 2 years. And there we discuss all things investigations, how they're done, the people and the techniques behind them.
Okay, what are you most looking forward to for Malaysia?
Okay. I'm looking forward to meet like a couple of journalists that I've never met before. Like meet new journalists. I'm like also looking forward to the Lighthouse panels. We also have like a team meet day. We're a big group that is going to JIGC. So it's also going to be really cool to see everyone jet lagged.
So anyway, over the next few days, we're going to be recording bits from inside the conference and also some like snippets from around the place as well. Try to give you a feel of what it's like to be there.
Exactly. I'm going to try and not get too overwhelmed by how big the conference is.
Yeah.
At the conference, I was moderating a panel about how to make an investigative podcast. So, in the spirit of podcasting, we tried our very best to get snippets from across the conference, including recordings with our team and also some backlight listeners.
The first time I heard it, I was like, I know that voice. And I was like, oh, that's me.
Oh, nice. How do you know each other?
We did our masters together.
No way.
So our partners are like friends from childhood.
Oh my God, small world. Yeah. That's so nice.
Basically, the way the conference is set up is that there are about 6 sessions on at one time, all in different rooms. And it's everything from workshops on pivot tables to panels about climate investigations and video journalism. So you end up spending a lot of time trying to decide which one to go to, or maybe you'll just decide to go sightseeing.
I'm debating whether I should attend leveraging scientific research for investigations.
Well, decide, because in 2 minutes.
Or botanical garden.
It's really difficult decisions here.
So we were both on panels. Beatriz was on one about investigating biometric technology.
Okay, I'm walking through the hallway, trying to find Beatriz before her panel. Okay, I think I can see it here. She's setting up. Oh my God, I found you.
Hello,
are you recording?
Hi, I just arrived. I'm a little bit nervous.
You're going to be amazing.
And Tessa moderated a panel about how to make an investigative podcast.
Yes, so today's episode will weave together clips from that panel, and it will be a bit of a crash course on everything from how to construct an engaging narrative, to how to keep your audience engaged, to even the practical stuff like how to organize your interview notes. And you'll get to hear from 3 really interesting panelists that I was with, and we'll introduce those people throughout the episode. Also, stay tuned at the very end. There's a bonus scene of Beatriz trying durian for the first time, which is basically the national fruit of Malaysia.
From Lighthouse Reports, this is Backlight. Every month, we take you behind the scenes of real-world collaborative investigations.
We're your hosts, Impact Editor Tessa Pang
and investigative reporter Beatriz Ramalho de Silva.
Hello, good morning. It's Tessa. It is the first morning of DIJC, Friday, November 21st, and I'm just preparing for my panel. I'm nervously pacing up and down in the hotel room. I feel like no matter how many panels I do, I always still get really nervous.
So my panel was basically the first session of the first day, which was kind of a blessing because then it was out of the way and I could just enjoy the rest of the conference.
That is a fact. Mine was on a Saturday afternoon, so I feel like there's all this suspense leading up to it. So I was there at Tessa's session, front row. I mean, I tried to be front row. It was packed. So the majority of the panel was really focused on the how question of narrative podcasting. But the beginning of the discussion started off briefly covering why podcasts and why audio. It is more time and money intensive, and I think sometimes reporters can have a hard time convincing their editors that it's worth it. So I really like what Susanne said about how it brings a different experience to the audience. So Susanne Reber is the founder and executive producer of Pitt's Gloria Productions. She's created shows like Revealed and Verified, which are incredible narrative podcasts.
So what I try and do is I try and go right back to what is it about these stories that captivates us? And for audio, it is literally the human voice. We can actually recognize our mother's voices when the baby is born. So it's a very primal thing that we're connected to with speech. So honestly, if there's one thing to remember is like the power of audio is actually that voice and letting people tell their own stories. And we are, as storytellers, essentially trying to enable me to get that in front of an audience and to let that audience connect with the core, which is the voice, which is the human emotion, all the things that connect us as human beings across generations and across cultures, which is emotional empathy, right? So even though you might not know this person, the way they're telling their story, because you're allowing them to tell their story in their own voice, is what's connecting with your audience, right? I've been an investigative editor my entire career. So I'm not saying that you do this instead of your fact checking and your, bulletproofing your investigation, but that's actually not what the audience is going to connect with. I know that sounds almost terrible, but if you've spent a year working on that data set, the fact is you're going to have to convince me as your editor, how can we explain it to the audience in a way that they feel it and it connects with them? So you're not going to be able to get all your facts into your story, but just remember, what is it that's going to make that person actually care about it, is what it is.
Narrative podcasting is all about connecting with your audience and building intimacy. One way to do that is through building strong characters. And a key character in that narrative could be yourself as the reporter.
Yeah, and that can be a big departure from how you would position yourself when you report on a written piece, where in many cases, you as a reporter are meant to be this fly on the wall. And it can be a bit of an awkward transition for people who are used to, for instance, writing news pieces. So Sue-Lin from The Economist spoke about how she managed that transition. She is the Asia correspondent at The Economist, and she has hosted 2 narrative podcasts, one called The Prince and one called Scam Inc.
I started my career at Reuters as a newswire reporter. I went to the Financial Times, again, daily newspaper, and then ended up at The Economist. So very much have come up through the tradition of print journalism. But I guess around 2021, podcast became a big priority for The Economist. And in 2022, I was asked by our editor-in-chief to make a podcast series about Xi Jinping, to which I didn't say this to her, but I thought, that sounds difficult. Could we pick an easier story? But of course, when your editor-in-chief asks you to do something, you oblige. The issue for me was, it's like being asked, can you please make a podcast series about Donald Trump? But you cannot go to America and you cannot speak to any Americans because it's too dangerous. And sort of if you're working in the audio form, as we've just been discussing, everything is about the voices and the characters and the people. So I was sort of in a bind about what to do. And sort of laid on top of that, The Economist has been around since 1843 as a print magazine. And so it was completely new for all of us. How do we sort of take economisty stories that are, big economics and geopolitical stories and turn them into a long-form narrative podcast that is going to move people and connect with people and have really powerful characters. So that was a 9-month project I embarked on with a whole team of producers who I think were tearing their hair out working with me because I'd never made a podcast before.
So Sue-Lin and her team made an 8-part series about China's leader Xi Jinping. The series covered 4 storylines: the leader himself, the story of modern China, the Chinese Communist Party, and Sue-Lin.
That was actually incredibly uncomfortable to begin with, because our producers said to me at the very beginning, okay, we're going to open the series talking about you, Sue-Lin. And I said, hang on, I am a print journalist working for a publication that doesn't even have bylines. I don't know if I want to open a podcast series talking about me. Also, many other people in this story have many other much more interesting things to say than me. But continuously from the very first day, my producers kept telling me, no, Sue-Lin, you have to be part of this story. And so we had a lot of arguments about how I was going to appear in this podcast series. And in the end, I think we reached a compromise where in episode 5, my storyline comes out a bit where I'm actually cooking with my mother in Sydney, because by this point, my visa had not been renewed in Hong Kong. And so I had moved in with my parents in my 30s. And so my mum was very confused as I followed her around the kitchen with my microphone. She's like, don't you cover China? Why are you here in Sydney? And how is this relevant to the Chinese Communist Party? But in a way, it actually got to my personal story about, the challenges of covering China. And in a way also that I was more comfortable with, because it was further along in the series. I sort of had established myself as a credible, hopefully, reporter covering China. And by episode 5, people probably are a bit more intrigued about who is this host because of the podcast form and how intimate and personal it is. And so we put the series out. And to this day, it's incredibly rewarding. I still get people coming up to me to say that they listened and they remember the series. But the one thing people remember, and bear in mind, I have spent years trying to study the Chinese Communist Party and China and this incredibly complicated black box of Chinese politics. But the one thing people remember is my mother. They're like, yeah, you made that series and your mum was in it. Yeah. And so I think that really says a lot about the podcast form and how to connect to people and what people are looking for when listening to a podcast.
2 things really stood out from me from what she said. Firstly, that audiences connected more with her mum than any of the other characters. And I think that goes to show how important relatability is. So if you're making a podcast, I think it's important to think about who your audience will actually connect with, what kind of stories they might remember, and that can shape who you might choose to interview. For example, people like experts are super valuable and can give a lot of credibility to your investigation or to your series, but they're not always the people that audiences remember the most. And the second thing she said was about showing the process as a reporter. Having Sue-Lin as one of the characters and one of the storylines really pulls back the curtain and gives the audience an insight into how the journalism was done. And I think, podcasts aside, that's just something that audiences are generally craving nowadays. Because we're in the age of, AI and fake news, I think audiences really want to know that they can trust the journalist, they can trust that the research was done properly. And what better way to do that than to bring the audience along on that journey with you?
And this applies to people beyond those making a narrative podcast. It's relevant to a talk show podcast or even video journalism. Even if you're a print journalist, you can think about using social platforms which give you space to show your process and explain how you did the work. And that's actually something we're trying to do more at Lighthouse, to go on video and talk about how we did an investigation. And probably the biggest roadblock to this is hearing your own voice or seeing yourself on camera, which I can relate.
Yeah, for sure. I hated that when I started on Backlight. I couldn't even stand giving feedback on the episodes because I found my own voice so cringe. But Susanne actually had some really good advice on that.
You know what? Get over it, right? It's like, honestly, that is the first thing that people like who are coming from text or other forms to audio, they're so scared of their own voice. And I'm going to tell you, it's really about the science. What we hear when we're talking is different because our voices are resonating inside our heads, literally as we speak. And then as it comes out and other people hear it and we hear the recording, we go, oh, that sounds like I'm 6 years old. Yeah. And it's because it is different from what I'm hearing in my head. You just got to get over it. You're connecting every day with your loved ones and they love you and they love your voice. And it's just be yourself. Don't get all like, oh, I have to be anchory and I have to perform. That's going to kill it. You just have to get over it. You are connecting with the people in your story.
Yes, next time someone tells me that they're too scared to make a video on Instagram and talk about their investigation, I'm going to give them Suzanne's advice and say, get over it.
Let me know how that goes, Tessa. I did repeat that to myself internally. When Suzanne said it on the panel, I was like, yeah, Beatriz, get over it. Just get over it.
Okay, so now on to building the story. So one of the most significant differences between a podcast and a written article is the way the narrative is shaped. Our brains process information very differently through audio versus when we're reading something.
Yeah, and it can be quite confusing because a narrative podcast, whilst it's technically longer in word count, it will probably use fewer sort of facts or hard evidence. And here's a bit of what Sue-Lin had to say about that.
One thing that The Economist often does is sort of very high level analysis. And so the producers would sometimes like bang their head on the table and be like, Sue-Lin, that is a topic. It's not a story. What is the story? Find me the story. And then they would literally take Economist stories and they'd be like, look, paragraphs 2 to 17 are analysis. And the first paragraph is the color. You need to flip that and we can have one bit of analysis and the rest of it in a podcast needs to be reportage and voices and stories. And so I think there are all these sort of things that I've been trying to learn as I've been on this journey. And then also in a typical Economist story, we're all about writing in a very dense, concise way, where we're trying to pack all these sort of analytical examples into 3 paragraphs. And in a podcast, you just want one example and you really want to draw it out and let it breathe. And so my producers are also like, Sue-Lin, let's take out those 7 other examples and just really hone in on that one single one.
Yeah, and I guess crucial to this is thinking about the experience of the audience while they're listening. Most people are listening to a podcast while they're driving or they're cleaning or they're making lunch, so they're naturally not primed to be receiving a ton of facts and they just might need more time to process the information. So this is what Suzanne had to say about this.
Yeah, the moment is key too, is just like letting moments breathe. You're going to know when you have great tape. Like people say hot tape, it's the tape that just connects with you where your producers are either angry, sad, or they're laughing. So it's those human emotions, and when you have that connection, you know it. So as you're recording, you're probably going to know it. So if you can go back and make notes of like when you connected with something, chances are that's what your audience is going to connect with. And it's counterintuitive. Sometimes you don't know when you're going into that interview, what's going to be the moment. Don't forget about that, because later when you get all, swamped with tape, hours of tape, you can get very linear again. I think it's always important to go back to the emotion of what connected you to the story, or, play tape to other people. That's a technique we use as well.
Those hot tape moments don't even have to be exactly what was said, but it could even be the tone that was conveyed. And I think Robbie had a really great example of this about his work on the podcast, The COVID Diaries. So Roby Alampay is the founder of PumaPodcasts in the Philippines, and they collaborate with journalists to bring a narrative dimension to their work.
So this is, again, speaking of another crisis, COVID, we were locked out of our studios. The Philippines had the longest lockdown in the country. And we could only speak to each other over the phone. And we couldn't produce content because we didn't have our studio. We couldn't even meet. And we told the staff, look, just call people and just ask them, how are you doing? So this is somebody who's describing one of the first people who realized that her father was about to die. So one of the first recorded stories and documented, and she found out over Twitter. And she didn't even know the name of, they didn't even name it, but the official reports made it so familiar to her that this must be my father. And so she rushed to the hospital.
I was singing this hymn, There is a Fountain. It's a Christian hymn. Do I just say, yeah, if you don't mind? There is a fountain.
So she just keeps singing, right? And that's it. There's no production, there's no sound engineering. The audio is crappy, but this was one of our biggest hits. And this series we called COVID Diaries kept our company afloat. At the end of the day, the reflection for us was it's not about the sound engineering. It is still about post production. We still have to curate the experience, but it's not ASMR, right? And we realized that as journalists, and I'm not an investigative journalist at all, but as journalists, the one remaining value to us is access to people. So as I tell people, anybody can take a snap of a burning village or a village that was wiped out by a tsunami. Anybody can drive by and take a picture, and people are doing that. But it takes a journalist to get out of the car, go down there, walk through the rubble, and not only take a picture of a hand underneath the rubble, but then to actually talk to people. So first we fall in love with the production and the realization that you can create much more powerful. But at the end of the day, what audio really brings is just that, as you said, that connection. What I loved about that clip is not just that she sang, but you saw that awkward moment when she said, "Should I just sing?" And my reporter didn't know her person and said, "Yeah, sure, go ahead." and and I think that's something that we all can relate to, and all of us were surprised.
Once you have those key moments, you have to ask yourself, how can I build a narrative around it that's going to hook the audience and get them coming back? That's after the break.
You're listening to Backlight, Lighthouse Report's monthly deep dive into the world of investigative journalism. If you want to know more about our investigations, you can subscribe to our newsletter on our website, lighthousereports.com. Or if you have suggestions on who we can talk to on this podcast, you can always reach out to us at backlight@lighthousereports.com.
We're back. In today's episode, we're bringing you clips from a panel that was recorded at the Global Investigative Journalism Conference in Malaysia. And it's about how to make an investigative podcast. It was moderated by Tessa.
Yes, but I wasn't the only one who spoke on a panel. Actually, Beatriz did a panel about her investigation looking into biometric technologies that were being deployed in the Global South. And here's a clip of us at dinner on night 2 discussing how her panel went.
Okay, tell me about the panel.
So I was nervous, but I think in the end it went quite well. I was happy. I said everything I wanted to say.
Nice.
So that feels like a good feeling. And afterwards, people came up and wanted to do reporting on this topic. And that was cool.
That's
Great
amazing.
success.
That's the goal.
Yes, totally the goal. It's so great to hear that you were inspiring different people to report on such an underreported topic. Okay, so back to the podcast panel.
I think one of the most difficult parts of any long form writing is constructing a story that has this clear beginning, middle, and end. And obviously doing this in a way that grabs the reader's attention. And it can be tricky to think about this whilst you are reporting because your reporting will follow a different chronological order from how you want your story to be read.
You talked a lot about the beginning. And I think what I try and think about is like, I talk a lot about story arcs. You know, what is that? It's basically a story has sort of a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? And whether it's somebody telling you a joke, they're not going to start with the ending, right? They're going to start with the setup. They're going to say, hey, you're never going to believe what happened to me, you know? And so it's like just trying to break down your stories and try and think about how am I going to get through this with people? And the endings can really actually kill us often because what I find, especially with commissioners, when you're trying to sell your podcast to, you know, Wondery or whatever, they will literally say, what's the ending? And you don't actually know, right? But you can still be talking about the arc. I think this is where the story is going, or it's just that it's as important to think about what am I leaving people with? What do I want people at the end of all of this listening? What do I want to leave them with? And that doesn't have to be a fact, you know, like as you found out, it can be an emotion. It can be like something they're going to go away and they're going to go to the pub and they're going to talk to somebody and say, you're never going to believe, I heard this podcast. You should listen to this. because blah. And something, whatever they say to their friend, is good enough for me. I don't need it to be necessarily the thing I was hoping they would say, but if you can get them to listen to the second episode, you're probably on your way. So when we talked about the story arc, so a lot of this stuff is classic storytelling. It's what the screenwriters think about. It's what the playwrights think about. Is like, what are the scenes? Who are the actors on the stage? Who's doing what? Who's the protagonist? Who's the antagonist? You know, and some of that stuff might sound counterintuitive for investigative reporters. Like, no, I'm about, you know, the facts, and I need to go and make sure that I'm telling everybody the right stuff. But at the end of the day, those scenes exist in your story.
Yeah, and this is something that we even struggle with on Backlight. Well, Backlight is not a narrative podcast, but, you know, once we do the interviews, we still have to construct some sort of arc for each episode. So it was really helpful to hear Suzanne's comments about thinking of each episode as kind of a play with a clear beginning, middle, and an end.
Yeah, totally. And we try to do a bit of that even in our long form writing. We have sometimes experimented with different storyboarding approaches. We might use tools like Mural or just a messy Google document, to be honest, but whichever is helpful to organize the flow of the story.
And besides having a compelling story, something that's super important in podcasting is using different parts of audio, including music. Because sometimes keeping your audience engaged doesn't just have to be through the narrative or through the interviews themselves.
Music is incredibly important, but it's also responsibility. So to your point about what kind of music, I am not a fan of the libraries because you hear, and you'll know if you listen to enough podcasts, you know, you hear the same stuff show up in so many, it's like, it's really problematic. So I tend to be really keen on original music. Obviously, it's a budgetary issue, but that is not a barrier. You can get great composers to work with you. Often we've had people work with us who gave us licenses to their music because they cared about the topic. So don't be shy to ask your favorite musician, somebody has a connection to the story, whatever it is, if you want to use their music. We compose, and usually it's a theme and then lots of interstitial. So I think about how many episodes do I have? How many times am I going to need music? And the collaboration with my composer is a very important thing. But the person who's scoring it is going to be the engineer. And you want to pick people who sort of have an understanding of not just slapping the music there as a bed. It's playing a role. It's a character in your show. It's just one of those things. It's better to have nothing than to use it badly. And your engineers, if you've got people who are trained to score, they will add something to the show that's unique. And in the most recent show I did, Arachnid, we actually created original music, which was a sub-project, from the data of this trove of data out there about CSAM that's being uploaded and downloaded millions of times every day. And we created original music from that data. So that became a moment in our show. You can really think this through, and it's really worth bringing the right people into your projects to work with you on this.
Music can be really useful to not just create a dynamic podcast, but it can be a really vital narrative tool as well. Sue-Lin talked about the importance of music in a context where there are some voices that you can't bring to life.
And one thing that was very, very difficult with making the prints about Xi Jinping was we just didn't have that many Chinese voices. And so that was something that we agonized over throughout the whole series. And I knew I wanted us to end with Chinese voices. That was the story, really. But how did we do that given all the constraints I mentioned earlier? And we realized that perhaps the most powerful way would be through a song that we found on YouTube, which is a very, very famous song in the Chinese-speaking world. Anyone who speaks Chinese would immediately recognize it when they hear it. It's sort of like,
Are you going to sing it?
No. Anyway, it's a very, 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 I won't subject you to that, powerful song. And it was people singing on the streets during COVID in a sort of semi-protest, but not a protest, which gets at one of the themes that came throughout the prints. And I think the second thing people remember throughout the series, Beyond My Mother, was the ending and that song, especially Chinese speakers. And people really come up and still say the ending was very moving. And it could have just been me rabbiting on in my voice, but that I think would not have stayed with people the way this music stayed with people. And then the only other thing is the power of the pause, which isn't something we have to think about in print either, and is something so powerful in podcasts.
Okay, so to end with some of the practical bits. A difficulty with any long form reporting is that you end up with so many notes and it can be difficult to organize them, especially when there's hours of audio. There were many panels at the conference discussing, the responsible use of AI and so on. And according to our panelists, AI might actually be helpful for podcasting.
Robbie and I are using it, transcription, production, but the human voice is the human voice. And at the end of the day, I think it'll win the day, and you just have to keep protecting it. And if you're going to use AI, you have to do it really carefully.
I'm no longer afraid of having too many and too long interviews because I transcribe everything using Good Tape. That's my preferred tool. I upload everything on Gemini or Notebook LM to be more precise. And then I can, while I'm recording this using my own notes and I'm organizing it, I remember somebody said this. And then I'll just ask Gemini and it'll pull it up. Well, he said this, these are the timestamps and so on. So that makes it just that much more easy.
And there's also note-taking software that can really help you out.
And so when I made the prints, I worked off a 110-page Word document. It was ridiculous. It was completely not fit for purpose. I couldn't keep up with all the interviews and all the research I was doing. And I realized at the end of that project, I had to figure out a new process if I was going to make another podcast series. And so I went down all these rabbit holes. I spoke to lots of people and I heard about Obsidian, which is just a software. You don't have to use Obsidian, but the key to Obsidian is backlinks. So you can link to like multiple documents inside the software. And that was a complete game changer when I made Scam Inc. Because at the start of the project, I didn't know what the ending was going to be. I didn't know what the story arc was going to be. I just started doing interviews. And with every interview, say there was someone in the Philippines who was talking about money laundering and human trafficking, I could, in that note, link it to a money laundering note, a human trafficking note, and a Philippines note. And after doing 30 interviews, it became obvious what my stories were because I could see which big notes, sort of the money laundering note, for example, had a lot of interviews and a lot of stories. And so I could then figure out what the story arc was. And so I highly encourage everyone who's making a narrative long form podcast to find software that allows you to backlink. And I actually think your stories then just organically emerge from the bottom up.
Okay, so that's all we have time for today. Obviously, there are so many things to cover when making a narrative podcast, and this really only touches on the surface. But at the panel, we had some really interesting questions from the audience talking about the challenges that they were facing. And actually, what was super interesting was there were similar challenges to what we face. So, for example, thinking about your audience, translating audio that's not in English for an English podcast. So, I'm super curious to hear from our listeners. If you have a podcast or if you're a reporter, reach out to us and let us know what your challenges are when you're trying to create an investigation or trying to create a narrative podcast and how you might get around them. You can reach out to us at backlight@lighthousereports.com and we'll make sure to answer. And as promised before you go, we thought, what better way to end the episode that we recorded in Malaysia than with a clip of Beatriz trying durian for the first time, which is kind of Malaysia's national fruit.
Yes, so for those of you who are like me and have never tried it before, it's this super creamy but smelly fruit. And honestly, I would kind of classify it as a weird mango. So after dinner with our food systems team, we thought that we should all try it for the first time. And the context here is people had told me it was awful, namely our colleague May Bowman, shout out May, who kept telling me not to try it, which obviously made me want to try it more.
Actually, we went with a group of people, and a couple of people had never eaten durian before, including our colleague Margot, and also Cynthia and Saraswati.
Guys, it's so
Okay.
slimy.
Okay, she's eating it with a glove. Okay, wait, everybody has to eat it at the same time. I think you should just take like as big a bite as possible.
It's so slimy. The texture is not nice.
Okay.
Okay.
3, 2, 1, everyone go.
It's not that bad, guys.
Not that bad.
Not that bad.
It tastes a little bit like mango.
Tastes like mango, bearable.
But the texture,
The texture is terrible.
horrific texture.
Horrific texture, Margot.
I'd say it's like an incredibly strange mixture of savory and sweet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Guys, but it kind of tastes like mango, but in a weird way.
Yeah. I would say it's like jackfruit's worst cousin.
I kind of like it.
Yeah.
Wait, I kind of like it.
So, Beatriz, I assume you're not dying to go back to Malaysia and eat durian again.
I would love to go back to Malaysia. The food is honestly incredible. But yeah, I'm okay with the durian. I don't need to do it again. I can see it becoming an acquired taste, maybe. I do really regret actually not bringing back durian cakes and sweets because it could be like a potentially funny and creative Christmas gift. And I know some people in our team did that.
Well, that's all for now. Thank you so much for listening. To keep updated with our investigations, you can follow us on social media. We have Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Blue Sky, and our handles are at Lighthouse Reports. Or you can subscribe to our newsletter on our website, lighthousereports.com. All of those will be linked in the show notes.
Please leave us a rating or send this episode to a friend. It helps. This episode was produced and hosted by Tessa Pang and Beatriz Ramalho Silva. It was sound edited and designed by Spoovio.